Well, welcome back from your poster session and everything else. I am moderating this session. My name is Sylvia Chou. I work at the National Cancer Institute in the Health Communication and Informatics Research Branch. And I know this conference, and I've had the pleasure of attending several times, is really trying to keep up with the sort of evolution of research at the intersection of social media and health related behaviors and activities. And I know that one of the concerns that keep coming up is, the social media is changing, data, ways we can use it and to do interventions work is evolving, and there are always new and emerging ethical questions. And as we think about these things, it's often like a catch-up game we play, right? We get ahead and then we have questions. And so this panel is really bringing together really a number of leaders in this field, looking at things from using social media for data sources, looking at misinformation, to using social media to mount interventions and health behavioral change type of work, to really looking at correcting misinformation and really thinking about what the roles are for noting that how much people are exposed to on social media is not necessarily accurate or maybe false. And we've heard several presentations today. So what I'd love to do, and you have the bios of everyone, so we're not going to go through and waste time on that, even though I think we could go for a long time just to hear some of your work. But I'd like to start by just asking each of our panelists, and it can be in any order. I guess we can go Sherry, David, and Mina, if that's okay, since you're, to just give us a quick update on sort of your current work at the intersection of social media and health, and reflect on one or two major challenges you've been facing of late that's really making you to think about the importance of ethical considerations in addressing them. So if that's a good way to start, I'll go on mute and let Sherry take the lead.
Thank you. So I am a clinical psychologist by training, and I originally got into social media research because I was really interested in creating online patient communities and using them as a way to deliver behavioral interventions. And so we do a lot of work with weight loss interventions where we'll create private Facebook groups, for example, but we use other platforms as well to carry out intervention programs. And we also use the same model as a way to test public health messages. And so this is on a variety of topics like cancer prevention and others. And so we're increasingly just sort of thinking about how can we get messages to people, whether it's to change their behavior or attitudes, by using the platforms. In terms of challenges, in this model, I guess one big challenge when you're working with platforms and engaging with patients on platforms is to know that the platform has access, obviously, and owns the data. And when I say data, I mean like the engagement data. So if we're having conversations with patients in a private Facebook group, obviously Facebook has that data. And so it's important to be able to communicate that to participants. And I guess a challenge is that privacy policies and user policies of the platforms are often changing, and you need to really stay on top of that. And I feel very responsible for communicating those things to participants that we enroll. We can't assume that people understand all of those policies and privacy settings. And so I think going into this work, it's important to really have mastery over the platforms that you're using to avoid any sorts of dangers. Because if a platform changes something, occasionally it's a kind of thing that will require you to make your participants aware of that. It could result in consent form changes and so on and so forth. And so that's something that we're constantly trying to stay on top of. The one way that can be difficult is that it's not like Facebook or Twitter or any of these platforms email you every time they update something necessarily that could be pertaining to your study. And so you really have to keep abreast of the news and information coming out of those platforms, so you have a sense of what those changes are in case they do create ethical issues. Another challenge is your access to the data can change over time as well, depending on what the platform allows, and that gets tricky. So
tricky when you promise in a grant to do something, and then what, suddenly you don't have access to the thing you promised to study.
Yes.
And what do you do about that? Right. Wonderful. Thank you, Sherry. I think this idea of keeping up with the changes and not having control over some of that changes is one of the major challenges, along with many others. So thank you for that overview. We'll go to David, and I think we don't have to be on the slide. Since there's no content, we can just bring it back, without sharing the slide. That way we can see more faces. Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure, and thank you so much for, and thank you so much for having me here. My name is David Broniatowski. I am an associate professor in the Department of Engineering Management and Systems Engineering at George Washington University. I'm also the associate director of the Institute for Data Democracy and Politics. I've done a lot of work on looking at vaccine misinformation online. Our work has been funded for the past 5 years by the National Institute of General Medical Sciences. We're just wrapping up an R01 there to essentially understand online narratives around vaccination and to understand what social media can tell us and how that may be different from what traditional survey techniques can tell us. So from an ethical perspective, I want to start out by echoing what Dr. Pagoto just said. I think one of the major problems with social media data is that it is not archival in any sense. And so when, for example, Twitter or Facebook decides to delete data, the terms of service for researchers are actually that you're supposed to delete those data too. And so in practice, what ends up happening is that there are a number of researchers who simply archive data and they ignore that particular element of the terms of service, and Twitter doesn't actually enforce it. However, for other services, for example, Facebook's CrowdTangle service, when the data is deleted, it's simply not available anymore. And so that leads to a situation where you essentially have a rich get richer phenomenon, where people who have the resources to be able to archive data will be able to publish better research because they have access to the data, which allows them to get the grants, which et cetera, et cetera. And so that starts to become a little bit problematic when you realize that there are real infrastructural costs to doing this, and that at any point in time, any of these social media companies could decide that they want to more strongly enforce their terms. And furthermore, they have changed their terms a number of times. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of social media data is quite transient. So I've done quite a bit of work on looking at things like online bots and troll accounts. And there have been studies that, for example, claim to show, well, bots don't matter, trolls don't matter. Of course, they're a little more sophisticated than that. But the problem is when you make claims like this, you're generally making those claims on archival data. And the reason why that's problematic is because oftentimes the platforms delete obvious bots. Now, the problem is then that you can't make claims about data that don't exist. And so our ability to understand the ways in which people manipulate these platforms is directly harmed by the ways in which the platforms enforce their terms. Another sort of corollary of that is that in many cases, the second order effects are actually what end up mattering. So for example, you might have a bot army that puts out what is obviously fake content with the aim of promoting a particular piece of information within social media users, a particular feed, within a social media feed, right? Nobody is going to engage with obviously fake content. But what ends up happening is that because the algorithm has now picked up on that as viral, because all that fake content has made the algorithm think it's viral, what ends up happening is that somebody who's a real person notices it, retweets it, and then people start to engage. And the problem here is that those dynamics are the things that people who work with social media data observe all the time, but you have to be really, really fast to get the data. And oftentimes, by the time you've put together the infrastructure to get the data, it's gone.
Right, right. And you can't study what's disappeared.
Right, exactly.
Right.
So long story short is our ability to actually even answer these ethical questions is hindered by our data access.
Thank you very much, David. That's excellent. So we'd like to go to Anne next, and I think your title was now a COO at Meedan.
Yes, yeah.
So, apologize for it. So please.
No problem, no problem. Thank you so much, Sylvia, for the kind invitation, and great to meet everybody. And thank you, Sherry and David, for this conversation. I always feel like awkward in these virtual conferences. I hope there are opportunities for us to mix and mingle at some point, but I just want to put down some of the resources in the chat. If anyone wants to chat afterward, also feel free to email me. And so what I guess I'll talk a little bit about my background. I'm an author and working in a global technology nonprofit called Medan, and I'm pasting a few links there. And I share this because it kind of reflects a little bit of the disciplines I bring to these perspectives around ethics.
Just for a second, I think the conference organizers can help send the links to all participants, because I think what we send is just among the panelists, and I love all the 60 attendees to see it. So thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. So first of all, I'm author of a book called Memes to Movements, which is looking at the role of internet memes in politics and society. And so, everything from cat gifs to MAGA memes are things that I'm interested in, and how memetics is shaping our information environment. But then also thinking about this from a practitioner perspective, my work at Medan, we're often thinking about how can we bridge technologists, people working at platforms, with fact checkers, with public health experts. And so one of the tools we've been building is called learnaboutcovid19.org. And what it is I often think about it as a bridge between public health experts who bring the background in epidemiology in general public health issues. But then also fact checkers who have a community of audiences. We work with fact checkers in India and Brazil and South Africa. Working on private messaging apps, like in WhatsApp. We have tip lines that are operating on the WhatsApp API, and it raises all kinds of issues here, like that Sherry and David brought up around archival, around how do you research private messaging apps in an ethical way? What are the ways that we can work with this data, right? And so we've been grappling with this while also making sure we're providing resources for fact checkers who are faced with questions, common questions. And one thing that we've been thinking about is that it's actually often not just misinformation that is a challenge. One word we've been thinking about is called mid-information, meaning emergent information, emergent science, that where it's good faith efforts, people who just are genuinely confused, or what happens when expert bodies come out with different opinions about an issue, right? Masks are the common thing. Most obvious issue, but I was just reading a good article in The Atlantic about someone who reached out to a friend who had been eating indoors in New York City for the past few weeks, and that person was just genuinely thought it was fine, it was safe, and so because that's a lot of the public health guidelines at the time, and so even though I think for most, a lot of public health experts like, no, we should probably avoid indoors right now. So those challenges are, in addition to just, kind of bad faith disinformation, misleading information, it's that stuff that's in the middle is often the challenges that we're dealing with, where people are just confused. And so we've been thinking about a typology for this, thinking about temporal mid-information, something that was true at one point, but is no longer accurate, areas of lack of consensus amongst experts, things where traditional knowledge about health, traditional health medicine might actually be informing someone's approach to COVID-19. So things like that are the kind of stuff we're trying to tackle. And then speaking to Sherry's point about you really like understanding and owning, understanding and owning the data and understanding like access to the platform, right? Is frankly, we don't have, full control over many of the platforms in which we operate. And so one of the other things we've been working on is called a content moderation toolkit. And it's a tool that's designed for folks who are not working at platforms to think about the many layers in which content moderation can happen. Because I think for non-practitioners, we have a sense that, okay, you either block the content or you don't. But there's actually a whole wide range of possible moderation techniques that can be both proactive and reactive, that might look different on Twitter versus WhatsApp, that might be blocking content, but also maybe just contextualizing content. And I think it's important that we add layers to this. And so, so those are some of the issues that we think about. And from an ethical perspective, I'm often lean towards a human rights orientation, where the challenges we often sit out with these particular topics around health is rights to freedom of expression, right? And freedom of opinion and expression, Article 19 in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. But then there's also Article 25, which is around rights to health and well-being. And so where do we sit? How do we navigate this? We're often working at these tensions, and I don't know that the resolve, but it feels like that's the crux of the issue, at least from Medan's perspective.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so I think definitely from just this opening discussion, the concerns are ranging from existential to very practical and somewhere in between, and probably all of it. I do want to start with a follow-up question to An's comment about content moderation. You talked about these different ways in the gray area and maybe downranking, hiding things, or whose role it is really to do this work. Does it fall mostly on the platforms? And I think by extension, I'd love to hear what others have to say, is basically what is the social media company's ethical obligations when it comes to these things?
Right. That's such an interesting question. And I think part of this is to remember that it's not even social media companies that are necessarily doing the moderation. It's often outsourced to organizations that might be in Ireland or the Philippines, who may not even have the contextual or linguistic knowledge to make intelligent moderation decisions on a global scale about these issues. And so companies will often set some of the policies, but then there are individuals who are fully divorced from the context, who have to then make rapid decisions around this. And so in that context, I think one of the things to recognize is the possibilities of thinking about policies that could be informed by health research, right? I think there's a unique opportunity right now. For those of us who've been studying political misinformation, there's always this pushback from platforms. Oh, we can't do that. Can't do that at scale. We don't have the resources. This year, with COVID-19, we're suddenly saying, actually, interesting. When the political will is there, the technology can emerge, the resources can emerge. But of course, there are disparities across language and geography. But I think to me the big question is platforms themselves, and I think we all know this, are operating in this kind of gray area in terms of democratic public space. We think of them as public space, but they're in fact more like shopping malls. And yet they're mediating our conversations that are relevant to civics. And so if we don't have transparent ways to understand how decisions are made, if we don't have ways that rely on kind of potentially like democratic discourse and public discourse, we're ceding it not just to private platforms, but then also ceding these decisions to individuals who are completely disempowered, underpaid, and working out of context to have to make decisions that affect all of our lives.
David, please.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that excellent point about who is doing the moderation and what are the mechanisms by which it happens. And I think one of the key things that this really touches on is this notion of explainable artificial intelligence, because it's not just people that are doing these. These are people who are working hand in hand with algorithms. And the way in which a particular piece of information gets flagged as needing moderation is not clear. to people outside the company. May not even be clear to people inside the company. I don't know. But one of the big questions becomes, how do you know if you're looking at something that maybe is eventually going to be fact checked, but is waiting in line, right? How do you know that you're looking at something in the right context? And I think that touches on, I love this idea of mid information, of information that's out of context, because I think that's so much of what we see. And one of the questions that I think the platforms find themselves facing so often is that they're often, in the press, for example, on the hook for trying to solve this false binary between true and false information. But in fact, there's plenty of true information that's simply decontextualized. And so then does it become, is it incumbent upon the platforms to educate people about the appropriate context? Do they have the expertise? Certainly not. They certainly don't have that expertise in-house. And we're talking about imposing quite a cost on them if we do require it, which then might have its own legal consequences. So I think that there's a really sort of a wicked problem over here that in the past has been solved through essentially regulating. But the political appetite for doing that is by no means uniform.
Yeah, what I'll add to that, I think when we say platforms, or we've sort of been meaning Twitter and Facebook, Instagram, but one of my concerns is, and if there's some good movement in these platforms in terms of flagging misinformation and that sort of thing. But I've been more increasingly worried that there's movement towards other platforms that aren't going to do that at all. And so it's created an appetite to kind of create this whole other social media space that there will be no way to control. So getting back to David's point about this is kind of goes beyond the platforms. If we got Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, to do everything that we wish that they could do, in some ways it won't matter, because there could be this movement to Parler and others to where, there's a huge audience over there. And so this idea that we're in silos within Facebook and Twitter, it may move towards we're in silos on platforms. So there's not even the crosstalk. So what do we do in that situation? I don't have the answer to that, but it's a big concern of mine.
If I could just briefly jump in just to follow up on that, I do think that there have been some policy suggestions that are sort of out there. Even just today, for example, there's a report that Parler has not been taking actions that all other social media platforms take. For example, to prevent the spread of child pornography on their platform. Mm-hmm. And that actually, that is a cost of doing business, of being a social media platform. But that does sort of run headlong into some of the extreme versions of this free speech rhetoric that you see on Parler, on Gab, on Vote, and similar sorts of platforms. Mm-hmm. I suspect that what we might end up seeing is a scenario in which some of the sort of more socially responsible platforms, and we don't often talk about Facebook and Twitter as the more socially responsible platforms because they're the biggest ones. They've been dragged through the mud, but it is a matter of comparison. And so I do wonder if we might not see some form of an industry capture, where the big platforms basically get together voluntarily and decide these are the standards that we're going to hold by. And then the question is, will governments endorse that and then try to put in place some sort of legislation that holds platforms that don't, endorse those code of ethics to some notion of malpractice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to add, to this point is also when we're thinking about governments, like I think one of the other mega trends happening with the internet right now is kind of nationalistic rhetoric that is entering the internet, and how that is then shaping the rise of platforms that might be bound by boundaries, by borders. It's already exists, of course, in places like China and Iran. But the other big wave that we've seen this year is kind of the banning of TikTok in places like India, potentially banning that here in the United States. And so when we're thinking about platforms and the potential like splintering, it's also highly possible that some of the challenges we're facing will also be at the geopolitical scale. And so that kind of consensus model that is, we're struggling with just in general anyway, is going to be multiplied by nationalistic interests. And so, so again, I'm not sure what we do, but I think it's important that we understand the scope of the problem in order to think about ways to tackle it.
Excellent. That's an excellent point. We have to first understand it before we can address them. So 2 questions that have come in, I think, are sort of worth our discussion. One is about source, the information source versus the content. So we think about problems emerging in. I'm just staying in this sort of space of misinformation and misinformation for a little bit more. And then I want to go back to some issues with informed consent and all of that. But in terms of information, we think a lot about a piece of a statement that's false or a statement that's problematical, but there are definitely bad players. Let's say if we are thinking about CDC labeling something as false versus Breitbart saying something is false. So how do we think about kind of the users' interaction with different sources? And I know in health communication, source trust is a big predictor of message trust. So definitely we are in these different silos. And the earlier presentation, I think, demonstrated that it's very hard to break, these information silos. So how do we deal with the different sources with different interests at play? It's kind of a big question. Yes, David.
Well, we actually we have a preprint about this and a study under review. But the gist of it is that what we've actually been finding in the case of COVID-19 misinformation, when compared to misinformation about other topics, is that there's actually more information coming from credible sources. And so that raises a possibility that we're actually facing what Joan Donovan calls source hacking. So the problem is that you can have a credible source that nevertheless amplifies non-credible content. So for example, if a credible news source decides to report on the QAnon conspiracy theory, and in so doing drives attention to it, makes something fringe into something more noticed. What I think we're starting to see more and more is actually the decoupling of source credibility from content credibility. And in fact, one of the other things that we of course see is that people who are traditionally misinformation purveyors, like naturalnews.com, right, have been banned from some of the larger platforms. And so what they're doing is they are laundering their information through other social media platforms. So it's easy for Facebook to say, we're going to block everything from Natural News. It's much harder for them to say, we're going to block things from these 300 YouTube channels that serve as pass-throughs for naturalnews.com content.
That's tough.
Right. And I think that again, like, there's this big question mark space. There's, the credible sources, the non-credible sources, which in our study, turn out to be a tiny little fraction of what's out there. And I think that's because we're starting to see more and more non-credible content moving through these sorts of laundering, user-generated channels.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that so much of the internet is has been focused, if we think about the history of the internet, it's been focused on content generation, content dissemination. But as a result, it's been a decontextualization machine. We just don't have our context. And I think a lot about food. Like my grandmother was a farmer. You see the cow, you see the fruit, and then you eat that, right? You know what goes into it, you know where it comes from. But today in modern society, food is decontextualized from its production and distribution. And so we've had to create infrastructures and structures. We've had to create organic labels. We had to create nutrition labels. We had to figure out ways to bring back context to our food. And I think that's something that is, if we can think about maybe the next decade of the internet, is how do we move from thinking about content moderation to thinking about kind of context dissemination to help identify this exact issue, right? Because I don't know that I want an internet where we are blocking or shutting down opinions, even opinions I vehemently disagree with, because of the dangers around free expression, right? Or dangers around creating platforms that can really clamp down on free expression and speech. At the same time, decontextualization of information, like what David's talking about, is incredibly dangerous. And so it feels like that if we could have that opportunity to talk to platform designers, figuring out ways to bring context back, it feels like it's going to be really critical.
Excellent. Thank you. So switching gear a little bit, I want to ask, maybe starting with Sherry, this idea that we're playing catch up. If you're designing a study on social media and you've given people consent, if you've gotten consent, and then the policies changed, data access, issues change, do you go back to the participants? Have you had experiences where that has worked or backfired or felt proved unnecessary or whatever? I'm just curious because I think a lot of the attendees have studies on social media, and this is probably a pretty common situation to encounter.
Right. So I think the decision is the change one that affects the risk of participating in the study? Because if it does, then obviously your participants need to be aware of that. So there's that aspect of it. But there's also the aspect of it, is it going to change the way that they can participate? Then you may need to let them know, because it may affect their participation, it may affect their engagement. And then there's other things that may change that would not require you necessarily to say anything to your participants, but you may want to change your methods. For example, Facebook, I'll use as an example, their algorithm has changed over time in terms of what gets promoted in people's feeds and what gets demoted. And there was a time where it was kind of hard to get group content, unless it was a very large group, to sort of pop up into people's feeds, because groups weren't necessarily promoted. It was very much based on how much engagement that group is. So if you have smaller groups, that's working against you. They changed more recently in the last couple of years, where content coming from groups tends to get bumped up, which has been great. But as that kind of fluctuates, you do have to think about what's the best way to get content to people and how to create a space where there is enough engagement to where it is going to appear and be promoted. And so it's not just about putting content out there, it's really about understanding how people are going to see the content, whether they're going to receive it, and how to kind of design a group to where that's going to happen. And I think that does come down to really engaging people in any sort of messaging that you're using if you're developing an online community, which is kind of where I spend most of my time. So I think there's sort of a whole science of engagement, which I talk about a lot, to really figure out how to actively engage people in the content that they're seeing, and ensure that they're going to receive it based on what the platform is going to do.
Thank you. Here's a sort of more personal question. You can obviously answer it without getting into, you can anonymize, but I think a few people have been wondering if you faced any ethical dilemmas in your own work, and feel free to cite examples without getting into details. Just as a researcher and as a scientist, a writer, have you faced anything personally? And share, please.
I mean, I certainly, certainly have a few examples coming to mind. And one of the biggest concerns, obviously for anybody doing human subjects research, is the possibility of reverse identification, right? This notion that maybe, your subjects can somehow be identified in a way that they don't want to be. And every time you publish something using social media data, if, for example, you paste the verbatim text of a tweet in an academic paper, in principle, somebody could take that verbatim text and Google it and go find the tweet and then say, hey, so-and-so said you were a bot, or so-and-so said that you were an anti-vaxxer, or so-and-so said whatever the case may be. And now some bad people are going to come out and harass you. And so that's a concern that my team has had to had to contend with when we've been writing our own papers and doing our own work. We as a team agreed that we would not do any, we wouldn't publish anything that allowed for the possibility of reverse identification. And so, we paraphrase tweets for that reason rather than provide the raw text. We don't publish tweet IDs unless they are for institutions, for example. So, CNN.com, you can, it's one thing, but if it's, even if you have a strong suspicion that this may be an automated account, you have to be really careful about that. And I think that it's very tempting as a researcher to think about your data as data when in fact it's generated by people.
I can share one story of something that happened. So we were doing a study that did involve some deception, which you can do with IRB approval. And the deception, well, was basically that a certain number of people in the group were randomly selected to receive incentives to do something. So some people were receiving incentives and some people weren't. The people who weren't receiving incentives didn't know that others were. So at the end of the study, you debrief people as to what was going on and why you didn't tell them that in the first place. And because we had connected people in this online community and we didn't debrief them simultaneously, once one person was debriefed and then shared it with the group. And one person was really upset about this. And so we had to deal with that. And so it was something that we didn't think through of normally when we have group-based interventions, people don't have 24/7 access to each other. So when there's debriefing or deception, you really have to think through your methodology and that research participants may be engaging more with each other than they normally do in traditional interventions. So that was a lesson learned.
Yeah, interesting. An, do you have anything on this topic?
Yeah, I think one thing we're still grappling with actually is how to deal with data from private messaging apps, because there's been a big call for data, right, to understand the scope and nature of information that spreads on private messaging apps, and because we run these tip lines with full informing of the fact-checking groups, right, and their audience members. The fact-checking groups on our platforms have lots of data about private messaging apps. And so what is the balance between kind of supporting research that can provide critical information about how misinformation can spread on private messaging apps, while also ensuring the privacy and security of the individuals involved? And it's super thorny. We've been working with a group called Digital Public that builds what are called data trusts. It's like a kind of legal framework for data that can help kind of structure the way we make the data available through legal mechanisms. So it's not available to everybody. Maybe there's a application form. Maybe there are different ways that governance is handled. We don't have a solution, but that's the shape and contour of what we're trying to get at, because it's such a thorny challenge.
Right. Well, I can assure you, I think you guys' work is dealing with very thorny topics. And I think on your reminder that sort of geopolitical influences affect what we do, and acknowledging that. And I always tell people we didn't get into politics. I mean, as a health and cancer control researcher, politics got into us, right? Like it's not something you can just say, wish it away. And how do you acknowledge it? And I'll give one example. This is my personal dilemma. A lot of the health communication research, we want to understand predisposing factors. So, media diet, political orientation, ideology, these are kind of important to measure, but sometimes there's a level of sensitivity, in terms of government scientists wanting to know, how your inclination. And we feel like it's scientifically justified, but at the same time, how do you, really strike a balance so it doesn't seem like you're getting into topics that are hard to discuss, as a health researcher. So I think our time is up. Unfortunately, it's very short time, but I think it's been a really rich discussion. I hope the participants have some good takeaways, and I want to just thank the panelists for sharing your insights and experiences. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. It's
Thank you very
wonderful.
much.
Thank you for sharing, David.